Okay, we've done a bit more tinkering and sorted a few things out. First thing to say is I've sorted out the air manager gauge problem. As you'll recall, the ADI and the flap indicator, surprisingly enough, weren't working in this Opus FSI synchronized cockpit. I have to say that both Opus and Air Manager have been exonerated as the culprit. This is really comes down to it. It's a feature of the Twin Otter Extended model itself. So it turns out that these two gauges are implemented by picking up the data from LVARs in the Twin Otter Extended model that are only updated when the virtual cockpit is displayed. Now, as you know, I've been running this new cockpit using a simple out of the window 2D view, and that's why I've stumbled across this particular problem. Now there's two ways to fix this. The simplest is to just use a virtual cockpit view instead of the 2D view, and indeed that restores functionality of those two gauges. I didn't really want to do that, so what I've done is I've gone and recoded very slightly, I have to say, the two gauges in question to pick up data from built-in FSX variables instead of the LVARs that it was used. Now that means we lose the detailed animation of the startup of the ADI. We don't get the gradual erection of the gyro, but that's, you know, neither here nor there. The ADI works perfectly in flight, and likewise the flap indicator now works correctly. So that's the first change that we've sorted out. The second thing is something I didn't show you but I did comment on, which was something about the rendering of the right hand windowed view. You know, it's very easy to get something in your head and be convinced that there's something complicated going on. Basically that was just an error in my fsx.cfg file. You know, from tinkering with the new monitors, there was a line ended up in the config file that just gave the incorrect resolution for the second monitor, so I just deleted that or corrected that in fact. The third difference that you might notice if you've got a keen eye is I've got a rear view mirror now as well. I've got another monitor up here displaying an extra windowed view. That's kind of handy because I don't have a full wraparound view for seeing the airfield behind me and so on. It's just something I've been experimenting with. It's not a great, you can do without it, but kind of a nice thing to have. It does rely on you having a monitor like this one where you can change the orientation. If you didn't have that feature on the monitor, you'd have to, or indeed if you displayed this as a window on the main screen instead of on a separate monitor, you would need to use a mirror to flip that horizontally. Now, in the process of doing all these experiments, I've discovered that this way of implementing side views is really a very dirty way to do it, and very unsatisfactory to date. There's just many problems with it, not least of which the inherent instability of FSX, which everybody who's tinkered with it will be familiar with. It's basically multiplied by duplicating or attempting to duplicate the simulator on a slave PC. I say attempting to. It's not even that simple. There's so many different things to take care of in duplicating the system. We've got to get the scenery products duplicated and correctly configured on both PCs. I haven't even got that to work. I've got the same Orbix software selectively installed on both PCs. I'm flying out to the Israel's farm scenery here. I can't even get the features of the basic scenery to be in step consistently. We've got the weather synchronization, which is crucial to get right. That doesn't work properly 100% of the time, doesn't even work properly most of the time. Now, it may be that there's some inconsistency or some difference between how things are depicted or rendered in the FSX boxed edition, which I have on the server, and the FSX Steam edition, which is on the client. But I find that things like the visibility layers don't sync up, sometimes even approximately, for the client and server. So you'll be flying and there'll be a nice sort of hazy view out of the forward window, and the size will be basically white out. So that's very unsatisfactory, unrealistic, and unacceptable, to be honest. So as I say, maybe that replacing the FSX box with the Steam edition on the server as well would fix that. I don't think it's something to do with the rendering of the weather itself, because that's synchronized. That's the one thing that's synchronized by the same program. It's generated by Opus and propagated to the client through the Opus client. So that's another problem. Some of these problems are workable on, I've got FSFX, Precipit FSX, I think it's called, on the server, which gives me improved precipitation effect, so rain and snow in particular. I don't have that on the server, I don't have that on the client, so that, again, we get some jarring discrepancies when we're flying in precipitation. I could install that on the client, that'll probably sort that problem out. The Rex textures need to be duplicated on the client and server. Now by and large that works okay, but again it's not working perfectly, and I don't know why. I've run the two Rex Texture Direct setup programs side by side on the client and the server. I've duplicated all the cloud textures. The cloud textures seem to work correctly, but sometimes the runway textures are out of step. Flying with snow on the ground here works on both the forward and the side views, but in other locations when there's snow on the ground on the side views, I don't have snow on the ground on the forward view. I'm just going to repeat myself here, but basically the synchronization of the environment, there are too many variables and they don't always match up. Traffic synchronization, something I haven't yet achieved. I did make an attempt to install wide traffic, and unfortunately that won't run. It gives me a SimConnect DLL error, and I don't understand why. I've got all the regular versions of the SimConnect DLL installed. The error message tells me that the DLL needs to be installed in the wide traffic folder, which it is. Unfortunately there doesn't seem to be any technical support for wide traffic. Other people have asked this particular question in the forum and it hasn't been answered in I think 2 years. So I'm not going to get wide traffic to work. I'm not even going to try. I'm certainly going to buy it for £40. So I don't have AI traffic to work. Just thinking about the future, I'm probably going to, I want to go back to using Pilot Edge. Pilot Edge has its own way of injecting the traffic. Again, I don't think even if I got wide traffic to work it would replicate the Pilot Edge traffic. Well, it might, but there's no guarantee of that. And without wide traffic or some other way of synchronizing, I don't think I would be able to get the Pilot Edge traffic synchronized on two PCs. So another problem. The problems go on and on, but even if I manage to solve all of those problems satisfactorily, the brutal truth is FSX is fragile enough already. I'm sure anyone who's tinkered with FSX to any great lengths will know how fragile it is and how frequently it crashes and has to be rebooted. Going to two PCs, you're just multiplying the problem, well, I'm tempted to say by 2, but given that the two systems interact over the network, I'd create new problems for each other. It's probably more than a simple doubling of the potential for catastrophe. And to date I've lost count of the number of times I've had to reboot one or both of my PCs. I've had out of memory problems on the client PC. Well, I've had that one time. It's just too much trouble, I think. And this is not counting how much strife the Opus FSI program itself has caused me. In some sense this is a one-off issue. You know, if the system is robust once you've established the views, then you know, maybe it's worth the pain. Now, I'm not convinced that the system is robust. You know, I've spent most of today tinkering with this again, and the truth is I've spent more of the time rebooting both the PCs, restarting FSX numerous times than I have actually flying. And the flying itself hasn't been great either. You know, the raw performance of this setup really isn't adequate, except in the most sparse of areas, as I think I've commented in previous videos. And then the Opus program itself, you know, it's infuriating trying to edit the views. I've done all the things it says in the manual. I think I've got all the permissions and things set up on the client and server PCs, and I'm fairly confident of that because, you know, I can create views and they are persistent. So I think if there were permission problems I wouldn't have got this far. But it's just so destroying trying to create these views, get them lined up, to get them saved. You know, they'll revert randomly, seemingly, to previous versions of the view. We'll get dynamic head movement effects turned on spuriously, and then you can't turn them off. Now you can see some of these things that I've been talking about in this clip of some flying. I've been flying here around the Israel's farm area and also 3W5 Concrete Municipal. Now first off, I should point out that I don't have the 3W5 scenery on the Slave PC. So what you see out of the left and right views is the default, well, it's the upgraded default 3W5 scenery from the Pacific Northwest package, which is installed, and then on the server I've got the full 3W5 package. So those differences aside, I mean, they do match up quite well actually. I mean, that's, you know, there's something to be said for not buying too many of these Orbix airport packages. The enhanced default strips are pretty good. But that said, some of the performance issues in particular are well visible in this scenery. I mean, this is a top-heavy scenery for running this cockpit setup. I can certainly get better performance in the Australia scenery and in, you know, many areas with FTX Global. But in this area, it's just very glitchy and stuttery on the side views. And what you probably can't see on the video is, as well, the side views are not really keeping up with the texture loading. So we're getting a lot of blur. It does keep up, you know, on balance it recovers, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination smooth. Arguably it's still somewhat usable, but I think what's finally going to put this experiment to bed is, if you watch this approach to this is the chicken field strip next to Israel's farm, and I'm just going to hook it around and make an approach here, and what you'll notice right away, just as I establish on short final, the side views pack up. And what's really interesting is I didn't even notice this until after I'd landed and stopped the aircraft at the end of the taxi. And that really suggests that in terms of peripheral vision, these views are pretty much irrelevant. And so really that's the point that I want to make. I'm almost certainly not going to persist with this experiment. It's been very instructive, it's been interesting, but at the end of the day it's not giving me the flying I want, and I think I've pushed it as far as I can go. You know, to go to another PC again in the quest for more performance is just going to be unthinkable. You know, I think the amount of heartache is just going to go up exponentially with the number of PCs introduced into the network. So I'm going to take these side views away. I'm going to revert to my 3-screen spread at the front, probably put my side panels back on for now. I think in the longer term what I'll probably end up doing is buying a third one of these Samsung TVs and then somehow replacing my 3-screen spread with those 3 screens in landscape mode. Now I know this is going to give me a super wide stretchy view relatively, but it's going to be a much wider view physically. I think I'll have the screens set back a bit further It's probably going to fill about 120 degrees of my field of view, and of course we'll get extra height. That's going to be, those screens are 40 centimeters high in contrast to about 30, and then I've got to just decide, you know, I can stay with the track IR and pretty much use the setup that I already use, but with a sufficiently wide field of view it may be possible to dispense with it will be possible to dispense with the track IR. The question is whether I want to do that and to use this kind of 2D out of the windscreen view instead. At the moment I'm not hurrying to do this modification because, you know, my basic system is already marginal in terms of performance. Going to 3 1080p displays, you know, basically it's 33% extra pixels to push, and so I don't think I'm going to be able to do that with my present setup. Maybe if I buy a new video card. I'm using a GTX 670 at the moment. If I went for something much more recent than that, it might be capable of pushing 6 megapixels without dragging things down any more. So watch this space. So there you go, the Almost Aviation Twin Otter cockpit forever, a work in progress.